So let's talk about what happens next. You talk about the end game for the war in Ukraine, and obviously Jake Sullivan is very deeply involved in monitoring back channel negotiations with Russia. And you write, there's little doubt that the Biden administration has actively considered ways to get Russia to the negotiating table. Last fall, Mark Milley, then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, publicly expressed his view the war would likely not be ended on the battlefield. So there's going to be a little bit of tension, a little bit of back and forth. So what are you hearing about all of this? I mean, as you point out, talks, if they occur, are likely to raise tensions between the U.S. and Ukraine. What do you see happening?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I think there's a lot of, I don't know if I call it wishful thinking, but, a certain naivete in thinking that, the Russians and the Ukrainians, or even the Americans and the Russians, are going to sit down and, have a big treaty signing ceremony and, come to terms and give Putin a certain amount of territory in return for peace. Like, that seems wildly unrealistic to me. And there are a lot of different reasons for that. First of all, Vladimir Putin has every incentive to keep fighting at least through next year's American presidential election, when Donald Trump might come back to power, who has consistently not been a supporter of the Ukrainian cause, has been against the large amounts of American military assistance to Ukraine. And so, the war is very, very likely to continue for some period of time. Charlie, it's a good question. I think that, there is a view inside the White House that Sullivan is looking for eventually some kind of negotiations that would end the fighting, right? Who doesn't want that? And the problem is, it's almost an impossible circle to square right now, because Ukraine has suffered so much. It's hard to see Zelensky being able to stay in power, frankly, and make almost any kind of a deal. The big fault line to keep your eye on is Crimea. And, Ukraine continues to consider that a core part of its territory. There have been, as we've noticed, these recent drone attacks and missile attacks on the bridge, the Crimean bridge, on the Russian fleet that's anchored there. The American assessment, according to my reporting in this piece, is that a full-out effort to take back Crimea might be the scenario where a Russian nuclear response is the most likely of all of the scenarios. And of course, that's a huge concern. Will Ukraine press on toward Crimea, and what would happen if it did?
Crimea. Well, when you wrap up your piece, you quote a former official who told you that the administration's hesitancy over giving weapons to Ukraine hasn't been about how Russia respond. It's that they believe the war isn't going anywhere. And you read that quote to Jake Sullivan, who said, that's kind of the rap on us. I don't think it's a fair one. We're not fighting for a draw here. And then he says that the administration has an obligation to the American people to consider worst case scenarios. That's our job. So how do you reconcile that? They're not going for a draw, but they're also preparing for the worst case scenario, which would include nuclear weapons over Crimea.
I think, look, I remember when Dick Cheney talked after 9/11 about essentially the government's responsibility to contemplate the dark side, and in some ways that led the United States into a lot of excesses and a lot of dark places of its own. Jake Sullivan is a very different character, obviously, than Dick Cheney, but the responsibility in a position like this, you live in the world of the worst case scenario. Sadly, with Israel right now, we're watching a pretty worst case scenario play itself out, the worst loss of life for the Jewish state, arguably since the Holocaust, right? That's a worst case scenario. And there are many, many worst case scenarios that we can still contemplate with this war going on as an open wound in Europe that threatens the security not only of Europe, but really the entire geopolitical order. So there's a lot of bad, scary things to have our national security advisor dwell on these days.
And they seem to be getting worse. You can read Susan's article in the most recent edition of The New Yorker, a very detailed deep dive into Jake Sullivan, Joe Biden's national security advisor. She's also the co-author of The Divider, The History of Donald Trump, which she co-wrote with her husband, Peter Baker. Susan is a staff writer at The New Yorker. And one of my must-reads every week is her column on life in Washington. Susan, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast today.
Charlie, fantastic to be with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you all for listening to today's Bulwark Podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. We will be back tomorrow, and we'll do this all over again.